Hello, welcome to my stream this month. I'm joined today by Robert Rust, who's going to talk to us about Arvo Pärt. I think that's how you pronounce his first name. Um, he's a fairly famous composer who I know actually very little about. I think a lot of people know very little about him, other than they've heard his name or come across him during studies. But I think this might be quite an interesting discussion to talk to someone who actually knows quite a bit about Arvo Pärt. So I'll let Rust introduce himself and tell us a little bit about himself, and we'll get into the topic at hand.
So thank you so much for having me on. I'm very excited to talk about Arvo Pärt today. So I'm Robert Rust. I'm a composer from Eugene, Oregon. Currently working on a master's degree at the University of Oregon, where I'm doing a lot of research onto Arvo Pärt. And so it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about that.
Okay. Well, I think my first question is, what makes Arvo Pärt different than, let's say, your run-of-the-mill contemporary composer? Because he's still alive. He's not like Ligeti, who passed a few years ago. He's still alive. If I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken,
Arvo,
he's still alive.
he,
Yeah.
he is still alive. He is retired, so I think
Yeah.
unlike a lot of contemporary composers who, just continue to write music up until the point they die, he is a little bit more restrained in his output. But one of the things I think makes Parrot very unique from other living composers is that he is by far the most performed living composer, beating out John Williams, who, the famous film music composer, who's we're probably a lot more
Really?
familiar with. And despite all of, being so performed, Parrot is usually only discussed briefly at the end of a music history curriculum in a university, kind of lumped in with another group of composers called holy minimalists. And
What does that mean,
so,
holy minimalists?
yeah, so the holy minimalists includes Parrot and then John Tavener and Heinrich Gorki.
Okay.
So these are all composers who engaged with issues of spirituality in their music, and particularly Western Christianity or Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Um, and they incorporated sacred texts into their music very frequently. Uh, in the case of Tavener, it was more throughout his entire output. Gorky started off more of an avant-garde serialist and then transitioned more to the holy minimalism style, similar to Parrot
So
in that respect.
okay, and then wait, there's another person who did that, which was Penderecki, who famous. I mean, he didn't go to holy minimalism, but he famously turned his back on sort of serialism and started writing tonal music after spending 2 decades writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and this is actually a similar case with Parrot. He started out as a serialist composer. He was, in fact, the first Estonian composer to write a 12-tone composition
The first
that we know
ever.
of. The first.
Okay.
Because you have to think, because he grew up when
When was he
Estonia
born,
was
roughly?
1935.
Okay, all right.
And so when he was born, it was a very brief period when Estonia had gained independence. They lost it not shortly after. Um, and he grew up under with Soviet occupation, and uh, with a lot of the sort of censorship and strict government requirements for the kind of music that people would be
Wasn't
writing.
Estonia proper was part of the
Yes,
Soviet Union, even
yes,
though
it was.
okay,
Now the
whether
fact
they
since it
were
was well, it was since it however since it was removed, it wasn't he wasn't in St. Petersburg
okay.
or Moscow. So the scrutiny that composers in um, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the the scrutiny that they had was a lot less than in um, Russia proper.
Okay. Um, it's like sort of like Rasputin,
Yeah.
probably, yeah.
Hmm.
Who was in what's now Ukraine.
Hmm.
So, uh, okay, that's interesting. So,
Well, I was gonna say
Yeah.
one of the things to keep in mind, in the Soviet Union, religion wasn't something that was going to be publicly put forward.
Okay.
Um, and so during the uh, 60s and the 70s, when Parrot really started transitioning away from serialism and collage technique into his more recognizable style, Tintinabuli, he started incorporating um, sacred texts into his music, um, which was a very radical thing to be doing in the Soviet Union. This is what eventually led to Parrot being censored by government authorities. Um, one
Okay.
of and that happened in, I believe, 1968 with a following a performance of his Credo, which is based on a sacred Christian text that somehow evaded government censors and ended up receiving a premiere and performance over Estonian radio.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and so it was sacred music all of a sudden being broadcast to everyone. Um, and
And
following that,
when was that? What time
this
was
was in
this?
1968.
Oh, okay. All right. So
And
sort of the height of Soviet power, I'd say, too.
definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
But again, since it was the scrutiny that composers in Estonia received was very different than
Hmm.
in because the Soviet apparatus could
Language, maybe.
there's a language difference, but these are more separate states that just they have their own authorities that aren't quite as strict, or they don't have the same sort of um, uh, censorship apparatus that was
Right.
so
They're not fully
well put
entrenched in the
together.
dogma. Yeah. Of the
Exactly.
right. Okay. So I've always been sort of interested in this because you generally don't hear about a lot of Soviet composers who are like serialists or 12-tone composers.
Hmm.
And I've always found this kind of interesting that there does seem to be this difference between East and West as far as composers are concerned. So was there actually like a Soviet authority that would prevent that, or was there a point in the '60s where I don't know, maybe Khrushchev said, okay, they can take some Western things, like take some jazz and whatnot. Because I know even like in
Hmm.
the Czech Republic, like rock and roll was even like forbidden until like the '80s and stuff. Well, what became the Czech Republic with Czechoslovakia back then.
Yeah.
So I know it was quite strict in a lot of communist regimes how much of and serialism could have been seen as sort of like a Western product in some ways.
Well, and that's why it really became so popular, is because this music, not just serialism, but any sort of avant-garde experimentalist music, um, but even progressive rock and popular
Mhm.
music forms. These were, smuggled into these countries, um, and these were the kind of subversive, angsty music that artists would engage with, um,
Mhm.
and they would give private secret concerts that uh, they would have to be very careful about. Can't advertise too much. Um,
So so bizarre.
oh, I know.
Yeah, it's such a bizarre
Well, it was in one of these
concept too.
concerts that one of Parrot's pieces, Salabica, was premiered, which was a setting of the Latin Mass. Um, and
Okay.
again, so you have very religious music that is now being performed publicly, and this is something that was dangerous to the Soviet power, since you start introducing Western ideas into the country, it breaks their hold on authority in the country.
Yeah, the state became the religion in the Soviet Union, so you can't have
Exactly.
a yeah,
Hmm.
competing authority, I think was the is has been the issue since if you want to see the origins of it perhaps in the French Revolution, the
Hmm.
the, the, the iconoclasm and whatnot, that it was the church was alternative authority to the absolute state and humanism and whatnot. So
Hmm.
it goes back a long way, but they just sort of made it law.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, uh, Now, I want to ask, when he started his career, was he where was it, where was he educated? I mean, how was he educated? And
Yeah, so he was born in just a small little town in central Estonia. The piano that he first had as just a kid, the middle register was broken, and so he could only play on the lowest octave and the highest octaves. Um,
okay.
but he received most of his education in Tallinn. Studied with an Estonian composer named Heino Eller,
Mhm.
and during his time when he was a student, um, he was remarked by his other uh, fellow students as being very musical. That he would shake his sleeves and music would fall out.
Okay.
Um, which is somewhat surprising given following 1976 when he transitioned to his Tintinnabuli style, which he's been composing in since then. His output has radically diminished. Um, and I remember hearing a conversation with Philip Glass, who had met Pärt, and they were talking, and Glass, was talking about his 10th symphony, and Pärt, he turns to his wife and goes, "You see, this man has written 10 symphonies. It's so much music." Um, and Pärt, on the other hand, has only completed four, and uh,
No, I mean Brahms only is. I mean, it's not bad. He's not in bad company. Brahms and
oh
Schumann
yeah.
only. Yeah.
Well, but you also have to look at the scale of those compositions. The
Yeah.
scale of the Romantics is very different than of uh, most music produced by more minimalist composers in the 20th
Yeah.
century.
It's a they're different. They're different. Schwerpunkt is what you'd say in German. They have different
Mhm,
focuses. Is the word I'm looking for. They're
mhm,
focused on different things, and I think um, for like romantics, it was like the pure, the emotional, the almost mythological that they could what they could create, and then um, minimalists seem to be very focused on the sound, the sonority of what they're
mhm,
creating. So I can see them sitting with triads for hours and hours trying to find,
mhm,
the right progression, which could have taken. But I think it's a very different process. So I'm always a little bit apprehensive when it's like, I mean, at the moment I'm looking at some like scores from Wagner and Dvorak and composing at similar times,
mhm.
and you'll see with Wagner that he's like really dense the way he
Yeah.
composes. And I mean, and I would even argue a lot of it's inaudible.
Mhm,
Um, but and at the same time, Dvorak is very like clean.
mhm,
Everything has its place. There may be like maximum four different things going on at once, and with Wagner, it's like 10. And in some ways, I think Dvorak is actually a better orchestrator. I know some people might get crazy that I say such a thing, but I think being clear and concise, it might have taken him less time. I mean, Wagner was famously very, let's say, neurotic about how he composed and the complete control. But
mhm.
I think there's just different processes, and maybe because Pert's symphonies have less going on doesn't mean it took him less time. I mean,
Oh, well, his yeah, it still took him quite a lot of time.
Mhm.
One of the things that became a feature in his music, the importance of texts in his music. So his Fourth Symphony, for example, which is written in his Tintinnabuli style, um, has a text associated with it. Um, in Church Slavonic, I believe is the language that he drew from. Um, Pärt is an Eastern Orthodox Christian, by the way,
Okay.
and his religion plays a very big role in his music. Um, but despite this text being in the symphony, it's printed in the score, so you can see it following along with the notes. But it's never sung, and this is a feature that occurs in a lot of his music is texted compositions where the text is never heard. Rather, he formulates algorithms and numerical sequences built off of the text that
Okay.
generate the pitches.
Which is apparently something Bach did as well. So I
Yeah,
mean,
supposedly. It's a
yeah,
little harder to,
supposedly.
I think, see. It's a little more
Yeah,
speculative with Bach. It's a
yeah,
little it's more obvious with Parrot.
yeah.
That piece that I mentioned earlier, Misa Salebica, um, it's in the title. There's a syllabic setting of the mass,
Okay.
and you can very clearly see that you have pitch sequences that are, like a scale that is ascending three pitches if it's a three-syllable word, for example.
Now, I don't want to be mistaken, but isn't it a characteristic of Eastern Orthodox music that it's monophonic? That it
Well,
only has one
chanting.
voice?
I was gonna
Chanting.
say, yeah, yeah, that's religious chant, and that's fairly similar too with Roman Catholicism as well. That's our Gregorian chant, and
Yeah.
that's a bit more what Parrot is familiar with.
Okay.
He has said so. Even though he is an Eastern Orthodox Christian, he uses those texts in his music frequently. He's remarked that the music that's influenced him the most is Western music, particularly that of like Palestrina or uh, Tomas de Lasso.
Now you
Those are
sent me something 2 days ago. You sent
mhm.
me a piece that it's like little. You gotta remind me of the title of the piece. Let me check.
Fiorellina.
No, the one that was just he redid. You sent it.
Oh, little more Tractus.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Um,
Um,
to me, the sort of the intervals in the violins were playing or the strings
mhm.
were playing. It was to me. It sounds really silly, but it was like Lord of the Rings meets Italian Baroque.
That's an interesting way to describe it. Yeah.
um, but what I think I'd like because we've gone from like his youth,
Mhm.
then we've jumped to 76,
Yes.
and where he changed his style. So he's
Mhm.
got about what do we have there? We've got what 3 decades of his
Mhm.
his youth, and I mean, if I'm thinking about it, his childhood had to have been right when World War II. I mean, when he was like 6 or 7 years old, right when I mean, you know, Russia was being invaded, and then Russia went back through. So it must have been quite a. I mean, people who lived during that time, I think, have
Yeah.
just a different outlook and different priorities than I'd say people born after the Second World War. So
Certainly. Well, and Parrot
yeah.
also, after he started at the uh, Estonian Academy of Music, he briefly had to stop his studies because he was called up for military service.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
and like many composers, in this, very dynamic and uh, part of the first part of the 20th century. Um, so yeah, the effects of the war and then later Soviet control certainly played a big role in um, his outlook. I think it's partly responsible for why he can seem like such a private person.
Mhm.
Um, he's not he'll give interviews, but he's not very forthcoming with his ideas and in conversations.
I think
So yeah,
this
this
is a
is just
common trait with composers.
yeah.
I was just watching a documentary about Saint-Saëns a few days
Mhm,
ago, and he was also very. I mean, he famously disappeared in 1890. He just left.
mhm,
He did. He just disappeared, and nobody knew where he was because he was
mhm,
tired of the attention. So I think, and I mean, even if you look at like interviews with, I can't remember. There's an interview where John Williams is asked about his family or his personal life, and he just says like flat out, "I don't talk about that. That's
mhm.
not none of your interest." And I think I don't know. Maybe it's just the maybe we're weird for being composers doing a YouTube video right now live, but I think generally we're actually quite reclusive types.
Well, what we're also of a very different generation in
Mhm,
who've matured in very different circumstances.
mhm,
Um, and I think that also plays into it. But by and large, I mean, you still meet composers. Anyone watching who's going through music school or has gone through music school certainly knows that composers tend to be the more quiet, um, not more introverted people
yeah.
than your singers or other instrumentalists and things like that.
Actors, yeah.
Yeah, the people who just by their very nature are more outgoing. Composers by their nature tend not to be.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting to maybe talk to a psychologist on a stream about why that might be. Maybe it's because
Yeah,
there's a value to silence too. I think the composers like.
certainly. Yeah.
Bizarrely, yeah. Silence is important, just as important as sound. So he's got 3 decades where he hasn't gotten to his style
Mhm.
that changed his career yet. So in that time, he's writing. You said serialist, atonal sort of stuff.
Serialist, a collage technique, so sound
What's
masses.
collage technique?
So he would be using
It's like Varese
quotation.
or
Well, it's more like he's using quotations from other music.
okay,
Um, so he quotes one of Tchaikovsky's symphonies, I believe, in his second symphony at the end. Um, Bach is another big
okay,
influence on Pärt. One of his pieces, um, I can't pronounce the German title, but the translation of it is "If Bach had been a beekeeper." Um, and
wow.
so there's a little bit of a humor in there.
From Bach
But
and
this,
an Imkervea or something like that.
yeah,
Imker,
something
I
like
think
that.
it's yeah. Yeah.
But at the end of that piece, he quotes Bach's Prelude in B minor from the Well-Tempered Clavier, and
Okay.
orchestrates it. So he has if you know that prelude, it has this very beautiful bass line. Um, and
That's a
bu-
very interesting concept. If Bach were a beekeeper, I mean, that's
well, the early part of the composition is very it's a very challenging composite piece. It doesn't get performed very much because it's scored for four winds, uh, eight strings, and they all have to be in there. They're all separate string parts too, with very complex polyrhythms and
okay.
very dissonant. Because he's using the Bach motif and he's building. Um, each instrument is playing uh, a different number of pitches from the Bach motif at the same time in different polyrhythms. So you get this kind of sounds like bees. It's a very kind of buzzing, fluttering sound.
So why did he decide that he needed to change?
So it was in the 60s he went into something of a self-imposed silence where he didn't produce any music. No, well, and not entirely true. He did complete both his third symphony in this period, and then a smattering of other
So
smaller
his first and
works.
second symphonies, I'm assuming, are collage pieces, or are they? I mean, I haven't heard them yet, so
Yeah, oh, yeah. I was there. Second one is more collage technique. The first one is
serialist.
serialist.
Or,
It's 12 tone.
okay, all right. So I heard his fourth a few years back, which
Hmm.
was very much of I think is post. I cannot say the word. How do you pronounce it?
Tintinnabuli.
Tintinnabuli. All right.
Yeah,
What does that mean?
it's comes from the Latin word meaning little bells.
Oh,
Um,
okay. All right, that makes
and
sense.
this is the actual term was coined by his wife, and it's something that he adopted as a good
A
description.
theory, or is it like
Not
his style?
it's a style. It's
Okay.
it because tintinnabuli can be described as a style, like a genre of compositions. Um, it can also be described as a very specific technique of organizing scales and pitches.
Okay. And how would one describe that technique in a
So it's a unique way of arranging scales and pitches um, that's separate from Western ideas of functional harmony. So he's using the same sort of materials that we're used to in functional harmony, but in a completely new way. Um, so, an example of this, if you have in a tintinnabuli piece, if it's in, let's say it's in B minor, and
okay?
I were to play
I
the
have a
pitch.
piano here, so people know
Oh,
what's
wonderful,
going
wonderful,
on. Yeah.
wonderful. So you
Yeah.
compare. So you would play a C sharp, and then
Yeah.
happening simultaneously with that C sharp could be a B natural, the nearest chord tone underneath the sounding pitch.
Okay.
And so now if you move that C sharp up to a D, the nearest chord tone underneath that D in B minor is still a B.
Okay.
And then you move up to an E, now the nearest chord tone is a D.
Okay, so it's interval relationships he's thinking about. Okay. Anything more? I mean, I'm still kind of a little bit confused how that's not just intervals. I mean, I'm going to push back a little bit, so because I don't know much about the system, so I'm like, we'll try and make this like the idiot's guide to how to
no, it's
understand pairs.
the unique systematic way that these things are associated. And so you would have an entire composition where the interval relationship between the melody voice and this triad voice would be consistent.
Okay.
And the first piece to employ this is his composition Fiorellina,
Right.
which
you can find. I'll tell people. I wish we could play this stuff on, but YouTube is so ridiculous with music. I mean, they'll at times they'll, like, for the most random things, they'll just block the stream or block the video for so we can't. But the piece is called Fiorellina. Now, why did he translate a bunch of his pieces into German? Because there's like Spiegel im Spiegel is the other one, Mirror and Mirror.
Well, I mentioned that he was censored by the Soviet Union for his piece Credo, and he had to escape the Soviet Union in order to, basically save his family. And so he escaped to Vienna initially, and then to Berlin.
Vienna.
And so, so he lived in Vienna briefly, and then settled in Berlin for most of the rest of the 20th century. Once Estonia regained its independence, he moved back to Estonia.
So did his new style come into being after he left?
Yes. Well, it started in Estonia, so that's where he first developed the technique. That's where.
And the Credo was 1968. You said
1968. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So he had to flee 1969 or 1968 immediately.
It wasn't immediately. It was sort of like that was the first censorship, and then it was a growing period of greater scrutiny. Because it was during that time that he started producing more religious works, and that's what really got the attention of the authorities.
Interesting. Well, I mean, you have to have respect for a composer who doesn't give in. I mean, who doesn't just, okay, well, fine, I'll compose what the system wants me to compose. I have enormous respect for that. I think a lot of people imagine that they'd be that person, but then the circumstances come, and then they just. So I think that's something to applaud. I mean, it shows that he has a true character as a person to begin with.
Well, it means that I think that he really believes in what he's doing. It's not just this an idea of something that could help me make a living. He probably could have been more financially successful, certainly safer, if he had just stuck to what the regime wanted.
I don't think he would have been more financially successicle. That's the funny part about it.
Yeah, that's true.
That's the irony, because
that's true. He's,
because people think always, if I just do what everything around me is telling me to do, then I will be the big success. And then oftentimes it's by actually not swimming with the rest of the fishes that you actually are rewarded in some ways. Not always. I mean, some people die, lonely and poor, like Schubert, but so is, or Van Gogh, but so is the world.
Yeah,
it's not always fair, but I think that's actually a important takeaway. I think people should pay attention to those types of composers, because it's oftentimes it's not being the conformist that's doing what's being told, what's expected of them to do in their current environment.
Well, this is why I think he's still very valuable for composers to study, because he's still incredibly relevant. More so than, by the numbers, than just about any other living composer.
Well, I think I'll just explain the like my first experience even knowing about Parrot was from the is uh, through the movie There Will Be Blood.
Oh, I've never seen it.
Okay, it's a good movie. Well, I think it's a really good. I think it's
Hmm.
probably one of the better or best like high quality movies of the
Hmm.
21st century. In fact, I don't think very many movies have been made since then that are as good as There Will Be Blood. It's just I think it's like at a Kubrick level, but that's the I don't want to get
Huh.
too fanboy about There Will Be Blood. I just think it's a really good movie. And at the time, I thought they used fratres. I think
Hmm.
the piece, and um, I at the time I thought it was something Johnny Greenwood had written for the movie.
Oh,
I thought,
interesting.
wow, this is really because
Huh.
he did the music. He did like other
Yeah.
parts of the score that were also very good.
Hmm.
But it seemed to like match that aesthetic. So maybe I don't know. Maybe they had paired temp tracks or something. I don't want to. I don't want to like theorize, and that maybe he like adapted because he has very interesting. He also did some interesting scores. An interesting score to that movie, but I thought it was from him, and it wasn't until later
Hmm.
that I realized, oh, this is this other composer.
Hmm.
Um, the movie
Can I
also
ask?
has
I was gonna say, can I?
Brahms's Violin Concerto.
I was gonna say, can I ask what the instrumentation for the for Fratres in the movie was, if you
It's
remember?
strings and piano.
Just strings and piano. Okay.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, because that piece and a lot of Paird's
there's a lot of different versions of it too.
versions of it. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
something. Well, because he started doing when he's transitioned to the Tintinnabuli stuff, it was almost like Bach, where a lot of Bach's music can work in many different instrumentations, and that's simply because it's mostly just about good formal structure of the music and then pitch relationships. Timbre isn't really something that plays too much into Parrot's um, creative thinking.
I also want to mention, I think people who were watching this who have never heard of Pärt
Hmm.
are almost certain to have heard Spiegel im Spiegel at some point in their life.
Yes, that piece gets
That's
used
such
all the time in films
all
and
the time in
TV.
popular
Hmm.
media, and maybe that actually was my first exposure to.
Hmm.
I think there was some like indie movie that used it in the trailer, some movie I think with Casey Affleck or something. I don't know what it was. I never saw it, but it was used in the trailer. Um, and I remember at the time thinking, this is it's so simple, but it's such a beautiful piece as a like a child seeing the trailer in
Hmm.
the movie theater that there's something so simple about it that but pure in a way
Yeah,
from the stuff I've heard.
yeah.
Um, and I'm not a big expert on Parrot at all by any means, but um, so how would you develop, let's say, if we're in Parrot's Tintinnabuli
Hmm.
system, how do we develop harmonies? Is he thinking in major or minor? Or is he just thinking purely in
He
intervals?
he's probably thinking in tonality, so he's probably thinking pitch center,
Okay,
B minor, A minor, that kind of thing. Um, and so then it's just a matter of scale and tonic triad. Um, Sometimes he'll also use the dominant triad as well. So fratres, as you brought up, that's a piece where it's D minor generally, but the
okay.
tintinnabuli chord in that is in A major triad,
Which major?
A major. So you have
In A major. Okay,
yeah, yeah. So
not
you have the
in A.
combination of a
Yeah.
D minor
The dominant,
scale
yeah.
and then the
Okay,
dominant.
all right.
Um,
But is he using the dominant scale?
he's using the
So,
dominant chord, not the
but
scale,
not the scale,
not the scale.
because this is an interesting thing about I discussed this in my secondary dominance video that a lot of the times it's easier to understand that like in older music theory, like if you have like a key signature, let's just say D minor,
Hmm.
you actually have a few. You don't just have D minor as your usable key signature. You have D minor, you have E minor, you have F major, you have G minor or G major, you have A major. That's basically where like melodic minor comes from, because
Mhm,
you have the tones borrowed from the dominant key,
mhm.
if you think about it. So F sharp, G sharp, A
Yeah.
are in the melodic minor. So uh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah. Anyway, so no, that would be an A minor. Excuse me. You'd have B natural
And
and
then
C
C sharp.
sharp.
Yeah.
Yeah, B natural and C sharp, because that's part of A major.
Mhm.
Um, so that I was wondering if it's maybe like that, where he's thinking, okay, now I'm in A major. It's not just it's so it's more. It sounds more like he's minimalist thinking.
Yeah. But because it's, you have these very simple rules, you can then stack up these rules to create very complex structures. So it's something that
Okay.
necessarily, like, the building blocks of it are very basic, but because they're building blocks, you can build complex structures on top of it.
Well, I think that's yeah.
And so
That's
in that
yeah.
well, it's like in that respect, I think it's a little bit beyond minimalism. Um, and
Post
you and
minimalist.
Yeah, yeah, that's something. Minimalist adjacent, because you listen
Okay.
to his early Tintinabuli works, and minimalism is a perfectly fine label to describe them. Um, but you start moving into his later period of Tintinabuli works, things produced in the uh, 90s and the early 2000s. Um, the music gets much more complicated. You have larger orchestrations. Um, denser textures, and things that you wouldn't, when you listen to them, you wouldn't associate with minimalism.
Oh, and that might also be because he was at that point of his career, he was given more leeway, probably more. He had more to work with, probably because he was more popular as a composer.
Yeah, well, I mean, he because he got so successful very quickly after 1976, um, he never really had this issue of having to find commissions. He basically never
So
had to compose on a schedule anymore for the rest of his life after that. Um,
so the piece you sent me is this.
mhm,
This is sort of like his breakout piece.
yep,
Um, it doesn't look like much. Let's be honest.
no, it really doesn't.
And
Um, but this
there's
is
not even I mean, we've just got we've it's written almost like choral writing, where you don't really even have like typical note values.
Well, it was just what people, remarked when they first kinda saw this music is that it reminded them of Gregorian chant,
Yeah.
and that's just obvious from the notation. You don't have, uh, quarter notes and eighth notes, you just have long notes and short notes. Um,
Hmm.
and the translation of that, tempo indication, it's, freely from within yourself. Um,
Okay.
and, listening to yourself, I think is exactly what it is. Um, and this is a composition that there is many different versions, many different ways of performing it. Um, so you can see from this example, you have in your right hand in treble clef, but an octave up. That would be your melody voice, which would be your B minor scale, and you can see in there
Okay.
you have scalar motion. You still have skips in there, but that's like a melody.
Yeah.
And then your left hand
Is
in the middle
is that?
staff right there.
I mean, all those lines. That's a very deep B, isn't it?
Yeah, right down there. That's a
Yeah.
B separated by two
So
octaves apart.
I think would be the.
Yeah.
I, I think that's a little too loud for maybe the people watching. So
Hmm.
that would be.
Hmm.
You're adding these notes to the tonal center, which is B.
Yes.
So he's got the scale
Hmm.
always over B natural. Okay.
Well, always over chords from a B minor triad. So you can look at the next measure right there.
Yeah.
You have E, F sharp,
Oh, from D F. Okay, D F sharp.
and
Okay.
and then you in the left hand you have lowest, the next closest pitch from a B minor triad. Um,
Oh, I'm starting to get it.
mhm. If you
Okay.
go to the previous page in the PDF, that I sent you, this is the relationships. This is stuff that analysts have come up with. This, I think, is specifically from Paul Hillier, who wrote the first book analyzing Pärt's music. It's from the Oxford Studies of Composers series. So if anyone's out there interested and wants to read more,
Okay.
um,
So these intervals are basically the intervals that would match the degrees of the scale.
yeah. So your dark filled in notes, those are your tintinnabuli voice or your triad voice that are just
Okay.
playing notes from a triad. And then your whole notes or your white notes there, those are your scale pitches. Um, and in this example, this is just an example. Is It's just a scale, but that those white notes could be a melody that could be freely composed or systematically composed.
It it might be a little bit not that visible to people who watch this video later, but the um it's written T voice, um M voice. What exactly does that mean? What does this T and M stand for?
So the T, Paul
It's
Hillier calls it
tintinnabuli voice. Yeah.
tintinnabuli
Okay.
voice. Yeah,
All
and then
right.
your M
And
voice, that's like your melody voice.
oh, okay. So the black is the T voice or the
Yes.
okay, so the filled in notes are the T voice and the M is the melody voice.
Mhm.
Interesting. I got it. Okay. And then second position is referring to
So in that first one there, it's T. He says T plus one. So first position superior. So it's the first closest triad note to your melody note. Um,
okay.
and then in second position superior, it's the second closest triad note to your melody note.
Oh, I got it. So it's like the possible jumps,
Mhm.
the distances away. Okay.
Yeah. A good
Um
analogy in Western harmony would be to think about the first position superior as being like a closed or close voicing of a chord. And then
oh,
your
and
second position could be a more open voicing.
got it. Okay.
Um, then you have the same kind of thing happening. It could happen below your melody. Same sort of rules, but happening underneath. And then finally, you can also have it alternate between closest triad pitch below, then closest triad pitch above, and back and forth like that.
And then technically, okay, we're in this example's written in A minor.
Mhm,
If somebody were to start using this, they could then, if they wanted to go into E minor, then they just sort of transpose the system onto E minor
mhm.
if they want to use this within the okay,
You could, yeah, you could transpose your scale. Could
right?
be an E minor scale. Like there's nothing prescriptive that says it has to be tonic scale and tonic triad. It's just scale and triad. Um, there's nothing that says it even has to necessarily be a triad. There's a few compositions of Pärt where he's using half diminished seventh chords as the tintinnabuli chord, but
Okay.
using the same sort of interval relationships between the melody pitches.
Half diminished seventh chords. So he uses just half diminished seventh chords, or
Well, it's just
oh
another
yeah, half
example.
diminished. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just another example of something that Pärt has done. Um, but as far as someone else who wanted to go on and use this, there's nothing to say that you have to use just a triad. You can use any chord really, um, and develop these sort of same sort of relationships.
Okay, got it. So if I had this, let's say on half diminished on D minor,
Mhm,
and let's say I just put D minor, a D in the bass, something like that.
mhm.
So I have the tintinnabuli from each one of those notes in the triad, so I don't know. Or
Hmm.
that would be perhaps like a basic idea of the system.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Might get some creative ideas from that. It gives you a no. Okay, so I think what I think this is why you were discussing earlier that you think it's important for people to study as music.
Yeah,
From
because this music is um has been demonstrated to be relevant to modern audiences. Um and currently in the classical music world, I think especially for composers, we recognize that there's a certain amount of irrelevant music being written by a lot of modern composers. It's just it's so alien and foreign. And if I'm just a normal person, I don't know anything about music, I'm not going to want to devote all the time and effort to understand new composers' harmonic language, their complex ideas. And
Mhm.
the thing about Parrot is that, yeah, we've spent a lot of time talking about the technique and the theory behind it, but you don't need to know that theory in order to appreciate the music. And and that's something that I think is just demonstratable by the performance numbers. He is so frequently performed.
Because people would rather listen to that than, I don't know, Stockhausen, but okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not rocket science, but some people are still having a hard time understanding it in the
Mhm,
industry, especially a lot of power brokers are still.
mhm.
This was the last stream I had. I had people on who, a person on, Michele Zaccanini, who was discussing academia, academic music, and you're actually in academia at the moment, so
Yeah,
you're within it. You're I had sort of the professor perspective, and you're a student at the moment.
mhm.
What would you say? Is there a weight to teaching Arvo Pärt? Do they take it seriously, or is it still sort of like you have to provoke the audience? I'm just curious, asking you because.
Yeah, I mean, I don't in my experience, no. It depends on your audience. For my music, because I employ these techniques in my music, um, the academic musician theorist kind of people, they'll
Mhm,
like it, but it's not particularly engaging to them.
mhm,
Um, but for the people that I know come to my see my music who aren't musicians, who just like listening to things, they get a lot more out of it, I think, than the more academic types. Um, that being said, I still think this is because Arvo Pärt is a very under researched composer. I think it's a valuable thing for people who want to go through the kind of academic scene, simply because there's so much that hasn't been explored and researched in his style. Um,
hmm.
so, as far as just being a gold mine for opportunities of things that nobody else has looked at, it's a place that's currently rich for lots of new people to jump in and uh, make meaningful contributions.
Yeah, and there does need to be new outlooks in the community.
Mhm.
Do you have a feeling that it's in your institution that there's like a stagnation of new ideas, or people are kind of stuck and don't know where to go
Not where I'm
with
at. I
music?
mean, the reason
Okay.
I was gonna say the reason I decided to attend, I'm going to the University of Oregon. The reason I
Hmm.
decided to attend there is because University of Oregon actually has a historical relationship with Arvo Pärt.
Oh, okay.
Back in 1994, one of Parrott's pieces called Litany was premiered by the Oregon Bach Festival here in um, Eugene, and and then Parrott went and gave like a 2.5 hour talk with the composers at the university. And the
Yeah.
professor that I'm studying with um, was the professor at the time who kind of got that whole organization, that whole relationship set up.
Okay.
Where I'm at, it's a place that is, this kind of stuff is appreciated, and seen as valuable. Um, I don't know if that's necessary. I don't think that's universal. So this is the kind of thing. Well, if you're interested in this, it's definitely important for you to do your research, know who you're going to be studying with, what's the kind of general attitude of the program. I think a lot of the more uh, elite schools, like on the East Coast in the United States, still tend to be a bit more on the experimental and serialist side of things.
Yeah,
Um,
I saw the Curtis composers thing on their website, and didn't see much different than what's going on in
mhm.
Vienna. But
On the
um,
West Coast, from in the U.S., there's more of an emphasis on like film music, even in a concert kind of setting.
neoclassical, I think, is
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's better. Um, I that's what my last guest on this stream told me, is that there's a neoclassical emphasis on. So I
Mhm,
think paired fits in better with that. I mean, numbers don't lie. I think there's this sort of aversion towards like the commercial in a lot of
mhm,
composition circles, which I think that's just like a word people use. I
mhm,
mean, yeah, commercial in what sense? Arvo Pärt is not Taylor Swift, you know.
mhm.
I mean, but people within our world who don't want to be like derivative or whatever, they will say, "Oh, he's a commercial composer. It's simple music.
The
It's meant for the
Yeah,
masses." But I'm too intellectual for that sort
and
of
and
stuff.
and my only response to that would be that um, if it's so easy, why has nobody else done it?
Exactly. That's
Because again, having been now engaging with this style for several years now, um, the music sounds simple. The ideas are very basic. It is not an easy style to compose in. Um,
effectively probably.
well, it's if you just stick with just kind of the very simple building blocks that we've gone over here, it's just going to sound sort of like parrot, but hollowed out of any significance. Um,
Yeah,
and
this is what I think, what I'd like to say, even though I'm not an expert on this system, is that even if it can give you ideas, you have to take those ideas in your own direction.
Mhm,
Anything you learn as a composer, you need to push it in your own way and change things to match more your outlook as a composer. Um, a lot of issues. I was thinking about this. Well, exactly while listening to Dvorak, because Dvorak is Dvorak because Dvorak is Bohemian.
mhm,
He's Czech. You're not if you're not Czech, that's first strike against you. And if you're gonna try and compose like him without being Czech, well, it's just gonna be, I think that's like the postmodernist copy of the copy of the copy. It's like the Eiffel Tower on a keychain.
mhm.
You're no longer, you're just copying something where he grew up in a sort of folk music realm, which is why I'd like to ask, what, like, besides his like religious feelings, do we know about anything like Estonian that Arvo Pärt that has some sort of influence on his
Mhm.
style of composing?
I don't well, singing. Um,
The way,
Singing
okay,
like, choral singing is very significant to Estonian people. Um, to my knowledge, just about, uh, everyone in Estonia sings in some capacity. Not necessarily professionally, but it's just a part of the culture. Even banks will have their own choirs in Estonia. Um,
this is interesting information. I think
mhm.
that gets to the core of sort of what, so that's what he was growing, even during, I mean, during Soviet
It's
times,
that it's that
this
it's
would
that
have
it's a
been the
culture
case. Yeah.
it's a culture that values the human voice. Um,
Okay.
and Parrot has talked about this as well, that, in his music, um, the human voice is something that he thinks about a lot. So when he writes for vocalists, um, there's a very human
Yeah.
element that he's trying to bring across in that. Um, and then the other side of that is that is his religion, and I do think that that is something that can't be um, uh, kind of sidelined in there. It's something that's, I think, emerged as being very central to what he does and why it's successful.
Okay. Well, because I always want to remind people of this, that you have to discovering who you are as a composer is not developing some new theory. I mean, this obviously what he developed came after 3 decades of doing serialist music, but it's also
Mhm,
mixed with his religious beliefs and, as you said, the Estonian affinity for vocal music, or
mhm.
just singing in general. Um, and I think people, um, not just the spirit of yourself as a composer, I think part of it also needs to be a spirit of a place where you are.
Mhm.
You need to put into your music. I also think that I'm just trying to take like this general things I think about music and sort of apply them here, because he's incredibly successful as a composer, and the
Yeah,
way he got there was very not the typical route. Obviously, he didn't come from the typical place. He didn't study in the typical place. He didn't. Everything is atypical about Arvo Pärt. In fact, before the stream started, I asked you, "Do we know of any other Estonian composers of note?" And I don't think we do.
not really, no.
No. So, I mean, obviously, you have to take these things into account when you look at composers and their styles. It's not just that they themselves alone develop this thing. Obviously, it comes from them, but it's also from a place where they were formed. They spent their formative
Cer
years or whatever.
Certainly, but I'll go back to the fact that despite the fact that Parrot is atypical in all these ways, he's managed to connect with audiences of completely different cultures and backgrounds. People who have no kind of shared connection with him. And I think that, and similar to,
I
other.
think the word I'd use is because it's authentic. It's authentic to something. Yeah, it's authentic to
But
something.
the question is that then, are other Estonian composers inauthentic? And that's why they haven't been as successful. And that's something I don't think that there is necessarily the uh I don't know if there's necessarily ground to stand on with that argument. Sort of like, what does it mean to be authentic to yourself? Um, and I think with what you see with Parrot is that it isn't necessarily about him just being authentic to himself, but him seeing his music as serving something higher than himself or something other than himself. Um,
That's
because one of the
another good
things,
point. Yeah,
because one of the things that he hasn't done, unlike a lot of other living composers, is that he doesn't offer interpretations of his music.
very
He puts it
nice. I
out
like
there, and he
that.
wants the audience to get out what they get out of it. Um, and
Yeah,
so
if
his
only
music is
if
in that.
only more people would do that.
Well, and what I think this reveals about him is a sense that he thinks of his music as an act of service to his audience. Um,
Hmm.
and
Another
I
thing
think
I agree with.
and I think that's why he's um, been as successful as he is that music isn't an expression of something within himself as much as it is an expression of something for everyone else.
Would you describe his music more as absolute or more as programmatic?
It blurs
Or
the
is
line.
okay.
Um, like I said, because with when you put a text to the music, all of a sudden it's not quite as absolute. Um,
Right, right,
and so
yeah.
when I listen to any of his compositions, his choral music that has an English text, all of a sudden his music is going to mean something more because I know what the words are saying.
Mhm.
Um, but if he's has a composition that's in Church Slavonic, um, I'm not going to know what these words are unless I read a translation, and so I can experience the music more as absolute um, in that kind of situation. Or in other compositions like the Fourth Symphony, which has a text with it, But unless I'm looking at the score, I'm not going to know what that text is, and so I'm still just going to experience it as absolute music.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. But there's even the I didn't know he actually. What's the primary language he uses for, or does he just go all over the place with the
He
languages he
goes all over.
uses when?
So Church Slavonic is important in Eastern Orthodox Christianity,
Mhm.
um, where he is. Um, he also uses Russian, and let's see, he has one major composition in Estonian. He's used English several times. Latin is probably the most frequently used, um, and
Hmm.
that's simply just because since a lot of his music is generally related to sacred music, Latin's just a very natural language to use for that. He has one major composition in Spanish. Uh,
Is
uh,
he a polyglot? Does he speak all of these languages,
I
or is he
don't think he
just
speaks all of these languages. To my best of my knowledge, he is fluent in Russian, Estonian, and German, and he
okay?
speaks some English. So he probably works with when he like sets Spanish, for example. He probably works with someone to help understand. Okay, where are the syllable divisions? Where are the accented syllables and things like that, so that he can set the text appropriately.
This is interesting. If I can sidetrack just a bit, because if you
Of
look
course.
at if you get a score to Haydn's The Creation,
Mhm.
which is I think one of Haydn's like magnum opus pieces of music. It's really really quite wonderful. He The text is both English and German. It
Mhm.
can be performed in both, and he actually explicitly stated he wanted it to be able to be understood also because I think I can't remember the exact circumstances other than Baron von Swieten, one of the people who financed the piece. There was some connection with the English that I can't remember, but it was important that there was an English version of the text. However, it's fairly clear, even though Haydn did spend some time in England, that English was not his um, a strong point for him. In fact, there's an anecdote that I think it was in Oxford that he got like a honorary doctorate or something, and he was supposed to give a speech,
Mhm.
and he just came up to the podium and said thank you, and then like, um, but if you listen to it in German, it just as the youth of today
Mhm.
would say, it just hits harder. um, it's just it's everything is done correctly. It's the right. It's that because that's his language. He's a German speaker, and the English it never it sounds fine in English, but it never quite works the same. Even
Mhm.
though he explicitly said it needs to be in both languages. So I'm always interested in that. Does that sort of come over in his pieces in English? Is there a feeling of
No,
like the
he
accents are a bit off, or
no, not at there are looking at the scores, you can see some places where it's just like maybe he didn't know this was a two-syllable word, and so he said
okay,
it as one syllable. And so you can see like an editor has gone in and put like an
a
editorial in
dash or
brackets,
something? Yeah.
you know,
Okay.
that's just like seeing this as two attacks, not as one. Um,
Okay.
and so there are little things like that, but I never get the impression that his settings of English are not idiomatic. Um,
Okay. Well, I
yeah,
mean, then that, yeah.
well, and
I
the other
think
thing is
that
that most of his texted things aren't performed in any language other than the ones they're written in, to the best of my knowledge. There is one example, the Beatitudes, which was originally written in English. Um, and at some point later, he was approached wanting to see if the group could get permission to perform it in Latin. Um, and they would just do the translation themselves. But he said, "No, I'll give you a new version with in Latin." Um, And so, to the best of my knowledge, that's the only one of his pieces that exists in two different languages.
okay. If you had to give like a tier list for people of who don't know much about Pärt, like myself,
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure most people, if they don't know the title of it a bit, have heard either Fratres
Mhm.
or Spiegel im Spiegel. Um, but if you had to tell like people, okay, you want to get a little bit more into Pärt, these are like the top 5 things, or 10 if you feel like it, pieces
I mean,
to look at.
absolutely, that piece I just mentioned, the Beatitudes. I
B-E-E, or because we were talking
be
about beekeeper Bach before.
no, Beatitudes, like, the from the Sermon on the Mount in, Matthew.
Oh, okay,
Um,
okay.
uh, yeah, so it's another, religious work. Um, his, Adam's Lament is, another, good work. That's, for choir and string orchestra, um, and probably one of his more significant compositions. Lamentate, which is kind of like a piano concerto. Um,
Ooh, okay.
uh, I'm just thinking of things that are really engaged because if I don't want to refer people too much to the very kind of minimalist things because if you're not used to that kind of music, it can shut your ears off very quickly.
Okay.
Um, Te Deum uh, is
Yeah.
another good composition that I think is worth listening to if you're not familiar. And then his choral music, finding some of his a cappella choral music. These are compositions that aren't in quite as a strict tintinnabuli style as the others that I mentioned, um, but uh, they're the music that first attracted me to Parrot, and so I think
Okay.
they're a good uh, gateway into it of just like, ooh, this is really nice. Let's learn more about it.
Proper proper
Yeah,
acapella, not
yeah.
annoying YouTube channel.
No, no,
Me 6 times in 6
no.
screams
Yeah,
thing.
and there
No,
are,
I just I
yeah,
that's the type
and
of acapella I can't stand.
no,
Where the people make sound effects and sing
yeah,
Mr. Sandman or something. I
no,
can't
no, no.
stand
These
that
are
stuff.
proper a cappella, you know.
Yeah,
And,
obviously. I
there are
just had to get
and there's
that
excellent
off my
recordings
chest.
of all of this music out there. Um, and so, yeah, you're gonna have no shortage of finding good recordings of Parrot's music. Um,
Right, because he's performed so often. Now, I
so
wanted to
often, yeah.
ask you something else because I have heard his Fourth Symphony. It was a while back.
Mhm.
If I'm not mistaken, was it the London Philharmonic did a recording of it,
I
or
think they
maybe
have.
several
I don't know.
Yeah.
I know it was I know of the, uh, I know the Estonian Philharmonic's recording and the Los Angeles Philharmonic's recording
And
of it.
when was that
2007, I
written?
think?
Yeah, okay. I knew it
Yeah, it
was
was in the 2000s,
relatively
and it
late.
was commissioned by the LA Philharmonic, and premiered in LA.
So that would have been under the baton, I think, back then of Esa-Pekka Salonen, was
I
it
think
not
so.
back
Yeah.
then?
Hmm.
Yeah. That's actually odd for him because I actually don't like the music of Esa-Pekka Salonen at all.
Yeah,
Although I don't
I love his
really
conducting. His
Yeah,
conducting's great.
it's conducting, yeah,
And I actually don't like if you're gonna listen to the Fourth Symphony, I recommend the Estonian Philharmonic's recording.
okay.
Um, the violins in LA sounded very shrill in their recording.
Oh,
Um,
oh,
and there's a lot of very high notes in that piece, if
okay,
you remember it, and so if your violinists aren't, you know, performing in the right style, then it can kind of come across as like very grating. Um,
okay,
there's a performance tradition that's kind of emerged around Parrot, simply because his music was so unique. It needed a great deal of, well, how the heck are we going to perform this kind of music that nobody's ever heard before? And so there's a certain kind of tradition that's emerged that's kind of very
How does that
associated.
differ? How does it differ
It
than normal?
it's so your strings are generally like zero vibrato. Same thing with your singers. It's a very you might call it like a very cold or crisp sound.
Okay,
Um, and it's often associated with like the Nordic regions or the the Baltic states. And so a lot of the music and recordings that you'll hear um, coming out of that general region are kind of informed from this style that developed around Parrott's music.
okay. What I wanted to ask about the symphony mainly is,
Mhm,
how is it structured? Because I think this is like the thing now. We're living in the 21st century. I mean, if you're ever lucky enough to, first of all, write a symphony that will actually get performed. I mean, I'm sure
mhm,
people write symphonies now everywhere that never get performed. Maybe they'll get performed after they're dead, like Schubert. But
mhm.
um, uh, I think the question is, how did he approach writing a symphony in 2007? Other than using his tintinnabuli system, is there like, because I'm so obsessed with form, does he
Yeah,
follow like any the concepts of like how symphonies were structured in the past? I mean, because even like
absolutely not.
Shostakovich,
No.
okay,
Nope. No. No, the fourth it's you're not gonna find any scherzos or sonata allegro form in Paird's Fourth Symphony.
okay,
Um, he, built it off of a text. So the Fourth Symphony is another example of a texted composition that, you never hear the text. And so what that means is that he took this, prayer in Church Slavonic, that relates to angels. So this was written for the Los Angeles, uh,
yes,
Philharmonic, and so he used this
I've heard this.
prayer that's related to angels. Um, and then using basically, numerical sequences, kind of like he basically it's like he made this mathematical formula that generated a kind of like a cantus firmus out of the
Okay.
text that then he applied all these tintinnabuli rules to.
Yeah, for our viewers who don't know what a cantus firmus is, do your counterpoint lessons.
Well, and that's really what a lot of his music is that he takes a text, he builds a cantus firmus out of that text, and then he applies the tintinnabuli rules to it. And so you can even do that with
That makes
like
sense. Yeah.
I was gonna say another. If you listen to that piano concerto Lamentate that I mentioned, um, the there's a section of it where he uses the Dies Irae melody in it. A very famous Gregorian chant, and he just
Yeah.
applies all of the tintinnabuli rules to it. And if you listen closely to it, you can hear that melody in there. Hmm.
Yeah. Composers love to use that. I mean,
Oh yeah,
we
that's
could do
been.
a whole we could do the whole list of everybody
Hmm.
who's done it, from Hector
Yeah, it's.
Berlioz and Symphonie Fantastique, which I think has the most bombastic version of it, with the
Hmm.
witches. I can't forget the programmatic nature of it with the bells.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, and then you've got Rachmaninoff uses it everywhere. John Williams has used it quite often.
Hmm.
I think Dies Irae is a good melody to use as a
Yeah.
composer. No, everybody knows what it's the sort of an inside joke now,
Yeah.
but shouldn't be a joke.
Yeah.
Anyways, so he doesn't follow any sort of rules, those sorts of
Well,
rules.
the structure comes out of the text, and so
Okay,
texts tend to have structures. They tend to have sections um, that you can then break apart and make your structure out of that.
that's fine. I actually think
Hmm.
that's a good idea. That's why I did the series a few years back about applying rhetorical figures to music instead of.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've learned about this, but they actually have like in the 20th century, I think the musicologists developed all these terms for parts of melodies.
Well,
Um,
some of those actually existed long ago. Johannes Mattheson, who was a
yeah,
18th
yeah,
century composer and music theorist, people were writing about affects, and um, they gave different names to different figures
and
in a symphony.
Burmeister too was the other one.
And so the people have been writing
Yeah.
about that for centuries.
By the
That
way,
that practice.
Yeah. Speaking of Matheson, some trivia
Mhm.
about him is he got in a duel with Handel, sword duel.
Oh, that's funny. But yeah, that whole practice of rhetorical music was pretty standard from the late 16th century until basically the 19th century. It kind of fell out of fashion once performers started becoming like rock stars. Because
Listomania.
the music just kind of started becoming all about the artist and not all about the audience. And that was the
Yeah.
whole point of rhetorical music was let's convey something specific to the listeners.
Hmm, hmm.
A lot of that revolved around the uh, return of Greek rhetoric, which started being rediscovered in the um, 15th and 16th centuries.
Yeah. Well, no, the reason I did that series is that I think those terms are far more applicable to musical
Hmm.
phrases than some of the more like strange 20th century stuff I've read that just by the language that they use. I can't remember the terms anymore because I don't find them very useful.
Mhm.
They just seem inapplicable. They're just not and you can tell that they're not things that people would have said in the like 17th or 18th century.
Yeah.
So um and I think you can people used to be like educated in the trivium, like
Mhm.
logic, rhetoric,
Mhm.
and whatnot. So um they aren't anymore. I think that's a great issue also for musicians.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was a different educational model. So back when that was common, it was the expectation was memorize lots of things, lists, and rules of contrapunctal motion away from on top of a baseline. That kind of thing was
Yeah.
pretty common. The educational model just about everywhere has shifted away from that now to instead of memorizing lists, it's understand concepts.
Yeah.
Um, and so uncovering that kind of rhetorical music is a uh, more challenging brain bending exercise than I think it even seems like it should be. Um,
Yeah. Well, I just think it's one of my interests. I think
mhm,
it's like understanding form at the microscopic level, but
mhm.
we're getting a little bit off topic. So
Well, I was gonna say one. I mentioned another piece, Adam's Lament by Pärt. That piece has actually been specifically noted by analysts of conveying affect in the same kind of Baroque style, and the
okay.
instrumentation itself is somewhat Baroque because you just have choir and string orchestra, and so it actually kind of does relate a little bit to what you've talked about in the past of about rhetoric.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
so as as something, watch your videos on rhetoric and then go listen to Adam's Lament. You know,
Okay.
uh,
Except I don't mention affect. I seem to have missed that when I meant read Matheson, but I use it more. Matheson has a book called the Vollkommene Kapellmeister, which I use often actually for my videos on forum, just as a small reference because he has little
mhm,
tiny paragraphs. It's a good contemporary reference on sort of Baroque dances and whatnot. And it's very funny if you read old sources. I mean, I'll just briefly sidetrack. If you read old sources, since we're talking about Matheson, um, they'll just say stuff, and they don't like. It's not like late 19th century, 20th century, even now,
mhm,
academic literature where they like cite their sources. They'll just say something, and then
mhm.
they'll just leave it at that, and you're like, what? And they'll just say it as like everybody knows the Spanish or this way, but it's like
Well,
what?
and some of that is because people did. Um, you
Yeah,
know,
people did know
like that.
back then, but now
Well,
now
yeah,
300 years later, I'm like, what do you mean that the old
mhm,
rage comic meme? What do you mean?
yeah,
I don't understand.
yeah.
I want to
Those are
know.
issues. Yeah, those are big issues with historical performance practice, and I think those are important things for
We
even
just
modern
don't know.
composers. Well, I
We
think
just
a
don't
lot of this
know.
stuff is important things for modern composers to think about, though, because uh, one of the things I think about in relationship to Parrot and this idea of creating new music that is of service to listeners um, is how, for example, Parrot studied Renaissance music and Gregorian chant and then developed this new, very affective musical language. Um, and to me, it's somewhat similar to the Florentine Camerata and how they study Greek drama and Greek tragedy and music, and then developed opera. Um,
Mhm.
so that there's a, and so both of these, and Parrot is just a big example of how studying the past is one of the best ways to develop new things that are relevant. Um,
Yeah,
and
because you have like a foundation to build off of, as I've
yeah,
stated several times. Yeah.
the reason this connects to historical performance practice and that whole thing is that they're making the mistake of trying to turn all this old music into museum pieces rather than trying to create new things that are engaging and relevant for audiences nowadays.
Somebody often I've often heard the joke that to historically perform the Brandenburg concertos would be akin to playing 433 by John Cage. because the Brandenburg concertos were never performed in Bach's lifetime. So obviously, you just have
Yeah.
silence. That would be the
Yeah.
historically performed way of performing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose with a lot of the church cantatas too, it's just like, okay, can we get all of our instrumentalists and singers in a really, really cold, stony Lutheran church? They're probably
And have
hungry,
them,
and
they all have to
yeah,
stand, of course, and
they're also
sway.
amateurs. Yeah, they're also
Yeah,
amateur musicians. These aren't people who've been practicing for
and they need
daily
those big
for
silly
decades.
bows.
Yeah, you know,
I'm talking about string instrument bows, but
yeah.
people who know what we're talking about know what we're making. Anyways,
Mhm,
I think the main issue with that, it's like I saw online, it's the same thing. Uh, Taruskin, the musicologist,
mhm,
he compared the beginning of the Gregorian chants. He says is like the light turning on in music
mhm,
history, which I think is a great explanation of what happened, because basically before that we can only like make inferred guesses. I know
mhm.
they found Greek or Egyptian stuff with melodic markings over it, but we don't know their tuning really. We don't know
Yeah.
much of anything. And I think this idea that like around the year 1800 the light goes on in music, that
Mhm.
before there was darkness and then we have sort of light, which it's probably sort of there's some sort of religious connotations in that comparison.
Yeah.
but but I
Well, I
think
mean,
I
the
think
hard.
that's
I was gonna say, go on. Go on.
yeah. And since then we had that sort of, we do know sort of from like the year 800 900 from the Carolinian chants and Gregorian chants onwards, sort of, at least in the church, for the first like 300 400 years ago, 300 400 years of the light being on, how music sounded. We don't know really how folk music sounded at that time, or if that
Mhm,
really. There are theories that the sort of Roman chants are actually sort of leftovers from maybe actual Roman
mhm,
music that might have just been passed on over generations. So that there could be bits of like styles from the Roman Empire, but that's all hearsay.
mhm,
Basically, we don't know, but where we do know things is from the year 800 on, and we actually do, because there's so many treatises written at the point of the Renaissance,
mhm.
how counterpoint was taught, how. And I don't know if people know, but there's a good book on counterpoint, modal counterpoint, which might have been something that Pärt was educated in,
I don't know if he would have been educated in that specifically. Well, he certainly studied
or
it.
later on.
Um,
Later
I was
on.
gonna say he studied it. I don't know if that was necessarily part of his actual education.
It would have been quite rare, I think, in the
Yeah.
40s, and the so.
Now, granted, one of the ensembles that Parrot first performed with, was an early music ensemble called Hortus Musicus. So a lot of the early Tintinnabuli pieces that nowadays, like, we might hear, performed by, like, string orchestras or, uh, modern instruments, would have actually been premiered on, historically reconstructed or actual historical instruments. Um,
Okay.
and
Interesting.
yeah.
So you have like
Also,
harpsichords, maybe
yeah, harpsichord, but certainly like with like baroque bows and got strings and things like
catguts,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's just because that was the ensemble that he was working with. Um, there's another interesting composition of his, called Miserere, um, that includes two electric guitars in the texture. They're hard to
Okay.
hear, like they don't sound like electric guitars that I'm familiar with. Um, but part of this is just because that style of Western music started getting pulled into, Estonia, and so this is just new in music, new instruments, that he wanted to write for.
That's also something I've talked about before, that I think there was this huge explosion of electronic instruments, beginning in with the theremin and the
Mhm,
Marta's I can never pronounce it. Mm, what that weird electronic instrument? It sounds like the theremin. Martis
Oh,
or
yeah, I know what you're talking about. The
yeah,
Ondas
I
Martineau.
yeah,
Mhm,
Orton.
mhm,
Uh, that were actually incorporated in things.
yeah,
Like Stokowski wrote sort of a orchestration. Stokowski, for people who don't know, was the conductor in the Disney Fantasia film back in the 40s. He was 30s, 40s. Was a very famous conductor. Very talented too. He did many great arrangements. But he did an arrangement of a Buxtehude Saraband, I believe, and he used the Martis. I can't say it. I
mhm.
just can't say
The Ondas
it.
Martineau, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, uh, and there's also like there were in like the 20s virtuoso theremin players,
mhm.
like who would play like the bumblebee and stuff like that. And then it just sort of it seems to like disappear. And
Well,
then
those
just
are
and when it reappears, I mean, it's either if it's used melodically, it'll be like in a Beach Boys song,
yeah,
um, or um, or in like B sci-fi movies. Um, I'm
yeah,
talking about the theremin,
mhm,
I just think there were like all of these instruments that then just the sort of like mainstream, let's
mhm,
say Adorno-esque Darmstadt composers maybe used, but they didn't use them well, in my opinion.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I was gonna say, it's also a challenging instrument to play,
well, you can't. I mean,
effectively.
obviously, it's us. It's sort of like the issue with micro tonality.
Yeah,
It's like people. This is like the video where I sort of went after microtonality, the simplicity video I made of like um I'm not against it. I just think it's and people were like, well, it's not complicated in the comments. It's like, well, it's easy to write the accidentals, but do you think your local guitarist has like a guitar with 300 frets on it? Probably not.
mhm,
Yeah, and it's I think it's once it's like you're thinking in theory, in a theoretical world, but you're not thinking about how the music is going to be performed. Is there an aspect to Parrot where you think he's sort of a realist about how the music is performed? Because there are scores I see now where I just look at it and I
mhm,
think the people aren't really playing what's written there. They're not playing it as written because it's basically impossible to play what this composer's written
yeah.
exactly as it's been written. You know what I mean? There's like pieces
Yeah,
by Boulez and whatnot where you just look at the score and go, "Nah, they're approximating what's written,
yeah,
but not the piece of
yeah,
art is more the score than the music itself."
I was gonna say with Peart, his, pitch is very important in his music. So if the music's out of tune, and you can run into problems. Um, and so there's a sense in Parrot that the only way to play it is for every note to be played perfectly,
Okay,
with perfect tone, perfect intonation. Um,
well then he
at
needs
the same
MIDI.
but at the same time, you pay attention to, for example, his choral music. Even though it is demanding on singers to be have very good breath control and be very in tune. He's very thoughtful about where to breathe. Um, Usually, there are other instances where he's probably evoking more of of a Renaissance, um, or medieval aesthetic, where he does have singers just holding these super long pedals. So
Okay.
just um, and
And you have to have an alternating one
yeah,
voice
but
jumping
but
in one
but
voice.
something that's just having examined a lot of his scores, he is careful to be like, okay, well, let's make sure that we give instruments lifts and breaths here. Um, giving so he knows what the performers need to do. I think. Um, so I
How
don't think
long are the phrases he uses generally for music? I mean, if
I
he's
that that's gonna sense a lot. Like I said, a lot of his music incorporates texts. If you have
yeah.
texts that aren't broken up with punctuation,
Yeah, so I mean,
or
how long would that be? Is it like one sentence, or is he doing a whole paragraph, or is he doing a
well,
whole
it could be.
prayer, or
Well, again, it's just sort of like, where is the phrase ending in the text, would
okay.
basically guide the length of the phrase there. Um,
Oh, so is when he does the sort of text to music.
Mhm.
Um, Other than when he's not, let's say, he's not doing it mathematically, because I don't
Mhm.
think we can get into that, or and I'm not that type of composer who's ever been that infatuated with, other than how to, break up rhythms and whatnot, the whole mathematical side, which I'm fine with composers who do that, but I just, it's never been my interest. Um, uh, Other than, I mean, I wouldn't say that with an absolute. It's just not, I want to get so into it where it actually break down a text and try and figure out like the sort of some sort of equation that makes it into music. But the question is, does he imagine like, okay, this is, if it was sung, this would be what would be sung, sort of like directly like that, or is it more abstract, sort of like what people think Bach did, where he has a letter that's assigned to a certain number, that's assigned to a
Mm.
certain maybe
Yeah,
interval relationship, or a certain melodic characteristic, or
I think Pärt is kinder to his singers than Bach was. Um, 'Cause
Mhm.
I think Pärt has an idea of like, even though there is, like, these mathematical kind of constructions, formulas, and stuff, the music is invariably still very lyrical. Um,
No, no, what
it's
I'm meaning is when
Yeah.
he does the pieces without voice.
Well, yeah, even I was gonna say even
So when
then.
the text is there without voice,
Mhm.
is he applying the text as if it were to be sung, but just without, like, if they sang it, it would sound like this, and then the melody is
Yeah,
da 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 da
it's
da
not
da da.
exactly like an orchestration of a choral piece. Um,
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
yeah, it's not exactly that, but it's still it's still it's as if the instruments were singing, I think is a good way to think about it. You can think about it like another from music we might be more familiar with, like Chopin. In his a lot of his piano pieces, you still have music that is very lyrical. You have these melodies that are reminiscent of the bel canto arias
Mhm.
of Bellini, but when you actually think about these melodies, it's just like no vocalist's actually going to be singing these melodies. But it's as if it could be sung. Um, and so, yeah, it's not impossibly long phrases. There's still, phrases that seem like they could be sung, um, but it isn't as simple as orchestrating choral music, for example.
Okay. Alright. I guess that makes sense. So if Pärt has been retired since when about?
October of 21.
Oh, okay. So and he's still, is he just not composing at all anymore, or
I have no idea. He could be composing. Um, he could also just be wanting to enjoy retirement and no. Well, I mean, his statement when he retired is he wanted to back away from the demands of public life.
was he like 87 now or something?
Yeah.
What, how old would he
Mhm.
be? Okay.
Yeah.
So
So
oh,
he's
he's
like a
getting up there, yeah.
yeah, well,
I
I was like, he doesn't want to be like,
Here he
in
is, by the
charge.
way.
Yeah.
He is.
I was just like and this photo is probably taken in the forests, not far from where he lives. Um,
And he lives now back in Estonia, or is he still in
yes. Yeah, when Estonia regained their independence, he moved back there. There's,
return?
yeah.
Yeah, 'cause I'm gonna
Uh,
say that does not look like the forests around Berlin.
oh, no, yeah. No, he's back in Estonia now. Um, well, and he's a major cultural export from Estonia too. Um, as successful and famous as he is, um, the Estonian government pours a lot of resources into um, preserving his legacy and creating uh, something valuable there for uh, future people.
This is a very superficial thing to say, but I would just like to draw attention to the fact that he's first of all in a natural surrounding, which I mean, as somebody who likes to hike and took a hike today, I think being in nature is very important as a composer. Just to hear the sounds of the actual world and not just your instrument is actually quite inspiring. I'd also like to draw the attention to the fact that he's not wearing a black turtleneck, and the picture's not in black and white with him looking very serious. He's just different. I mean, the black turtleneck thing is obviously a reference to sort of your mid-century modernist, but he just he's he's not of that, and the fact that he's the most popular, it must drive some of them crazy. I can't I could imagine it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't I've never really talked to people who have a gripe against Parrot. There are people who have you know, think it's too simple
Okay,
and
yeah.
don't pay attention to that. But
It's
most
probably
people
the same people who think Mozart is too simple or whatever.
yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of those things that's just like you reach a certain level of success like he has, it's kind of hard to even attack it.
Yeah.
It's just like, well, you can't attack it without being like, you can't accuse him of being really commercial and just appealing to what people want to do because he developed a whole, new technique of music and has spawned, a, emerging form of analysis of and engaging with this music. Um, no, I think the biggest thing with Parrot is that he probably just gets ignored simply because as we've kind of discussed a little bit, it's kind of hard to pay attention and analyze his music without also having to engage with his religious faith.
Mhm.
And I think those are things that tend that since once you start to have to like think about theology in relation to music, um, it becomes a little bit harder for musicians and
Yeah,
theorists to engage with it.
yeah, you got to think about that too, though. If you look at Bach, I mean, it's just it's just some composers are wedded to that. You have to ignore it, and it's kind of
Yeah,
silly. But
it's
I mean
I
that,
think it's easy. I think it's easier with Bach because he's definitely more foundational to our musical life. Um,
yeah.
and there's also plenty examples of Bach that aren't religious works. Like you can look at the Wild Tempered Clavier and not have to think about, oh, Bach's a Lutheran and he wrote church music his whole life.
Well, there
Um,
are people who do that, though.
there
They'll
are
say
people that do that, but you can't
every
really
time
say,
he does a figure like this,
yeah,
which is just as a tenth going into a sixth,
um,
is the cross.
yeah,
And then there's the pieces where he does that all the time, where it's just something
mhm,
like that. Well, then is that what is that supposed to be? A graveyard?
yeah.
What's the piece supposed to mean?
Well, and the thing with Parrot is that there's really no way to divorce his religion from his music, and that's simply because just about everything that he's produced from 1976 onward um, is connected to a sacred text of some kind. You just don't have enough repertoire there to um, ignore it, and so if you're engaging with it. And so the best option then, if you don't want to touch religion in music, is okay. Well, we're just not going to touch this music at all. Um, and so
Yeah,
that's my personal um, speculation as to why he's been as ignored by academics as he has been. Um, but also, I think the fact that he's alive and it's always difficult to you know really engage critically with a composer's work when he's still alive. Um,
yeah. Well, I mean, I think your theory is probably more than likely true. I mean, if we consider like the sort of where a lot of the avant-garde came from in music, which is
yeah.
probably mostly Darmstadt, and I'd say um, that there is a sort of like a Marxist component to that, which is when Marx said, famously, religion is the opiate of the masses or whatever.
Hmm.
So, they probably, those people look down on it, which is, I guess that's fine. They can do that, but, if that's the reason for ignoring him, it's just kind of sad again.
Well, and it goes back to what I said is like, okay, well, if you want to be relevant and interesting, um, pushing back against that, I'm not going to pay attention to this because it's religious kind of mindset that I
Mhm,
still think um, is dominant in a lot of academic settings. That's
mhm.
immediately going to make you more interesting. Um,
Yeah.
and and so it's just a matter of just like, okay, well, if I really want to, do this whole music thing, well, setting yourself apart is a big part of that, and there's lots of ways to do that with Pärt, I think specifically since he's so successful. But
I
there are
have to
other.
ask one question. Did has any churches of any kind? I mean, I know he's Orthodox, but has he
Mhm.
been? Have they commissioned pieces from him in any sort of?
Oh yeah,
And
plenty. I was gonna say, and there's, if you just look through his compositions, you see lots of things that were commissioned by churches, monasteries, things like that.
yeah,
Yeah, a lot of them were. I mean, that piece we mentioned earlier, "Little More Tractus," was commissioned by. I think it's the because that piece it takes it an excerpt from a sermon, and it was commissioned by the cathedral that the preacher who he preached at that sermon or that sermon at that church, um, and so a lot of his music has been commissioned by religious institutions.
okay.
Um,
So it's good to know there are religious institutions still commissioning compositions. So
yeah, I think a lot of them are. They're definitely more historical locations. Um,
okay.
so they aren't necessarily like your run of the mill Baptist church in Louisiana.
No, I'm
Um,
just
it's yeah. So there are still religious organizations commissioning music. Um, and I imagine they probably have a more limited stock of composers that they are interested in commissioning from, though.
right. Yeah, I mean, generally they should be of the same faith or the same denomination.
It depends. I mean,
Yeah.
depending on the religious bent of these, and some of these places have been, for example, the one were just talking about was more from an Anglican background. You could be
Okay.
also going to have Catholic and Orthodox backgrounds, and they have different, you know, uh, perspectives on well, how much are we going to engage with uh, artists and individuals who aren't of our particular denomination. Um, and but I think also, you know, I'll go back to the point that a lot of the places that these things were commissioned from were like historical churches. So there is a certain amount of well, this is an important cultural site as well, and so we want to commission important cultural music to go along with it.
Okay. Oh, it's just nice to hear that it still exists in some capacity because
Hmm.
I think it is sort of necessary because that is as I've stated as I stated in the last video. Maybe I'll make like an edited video about it. It's basically there are kind of like three things that make classical music what it is.
Hmm.
One of them is the church, whether you want to accept it or not. Most of the rules that we learn as composers, a lot of them came into existence for just for church music.
Hmm.
I mean, the whole thing with the avoiding the tritone and whatnot has really even at the beginning when like thirds and sixths were considered salacious. I mean, that you couldn't write because there's the intervals were too lovely sounding. There's things we learn about music and things that have been passed on rules for like writing for choir and whatnot. They came out of the church.
Hmm.
Then the instrumental stuff obviously comes out sort of like the sort of the aristocracy that financed things. So you have that aspect, and um, who also gathered the sort of like a large amount of knowledge. So like if you think of the Medici family, they probably
Yeah.
had gotten books from the Crusades and whatnot that were after the fall of Constantinople. A lot of those books and stuff about rhetoric and whatever ended up in Italy, and might have led also to sort of the main phase of the Renaissance was all of that knowledge getting transferred. So you have this aristocracy sort of thing, you have the church,
Hmm.
and then you have the folk music aspect. If you think about like the earliest examples of that we have are like the mini singer or troubadours that we know
Hmm.
about. I mean, so there's sort of like three pillars that you kind of need to understand. And if you get rid of the church and you get rid of the folk, and we don't really have the aristocracy anymore. But that's sort of I think been replaced by academia in a
Hmm.
way. It's sort of like the new church, the new cathedral. But for the most part, I think to just ignore that and just sort of discount it, I'm not going to learn anything about it. I mean, you don't have to be religious, but you have to understand that it's part of our culture and tradition. It's part of what makes European music or Western music the way it is.
Well, I would say it's not even just part of it, it's the foundation of it.
Yeah.
Um, and we mentioned the Florentine Camerata, and the whole and the emergence of opera, which was essentially just a rebellion against polyphony, in which was basically just all sacred music. But I mean, at that
Hmm.
time, prior to that, in the Renaissance, even your secular songs would still be polyphonic.
Yeah.
Um, and so the rebellion against that, um, led to more of the kind of truly secular music that we think about. But all of this stuff really just had its roots with Gregorian chant, and chant
Hmm.
music in general. Because you mentioned, Gregorian chant, all of a sudden a light went off in,
Hmm.
800 or whatever. And that's just when that music started to enter history as notated music. And
Yeah.
but in all likelihood, that music existed as a sung tradition for centuries beforehand.
Yeah. That's the theory, basically, is that when Charlemagne took over, he wanted sort of like to standardize,
Yeah. Hmm.
sort of reimagine Rome again, and what had been lost of a few centuries prior.
Hmm.
So he needed like monks to standardize the music. It was sort of almost kind of, one could see it as a type of sort of like, this is the music of the church. Whatever your region is doing is not allowed. This is what we
Hmm.
get. So we need a way to, sort of transport that music to, all edges of the Carolinian Empire, or I don't think it
Hmm.
was empire, kingdom, whatever it was called. Um, so uh, it was made. Music came into existence basically so chants could be transported.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
well, well, the
Notation, it came into existence. Yeah,
yeah, I was say there's a certain amount of, let's standardize this, but there's also a pedagogical component to it as well.
yeah,
Um, because if you start having plagues, and oh no, all of the musicians have died, how are we going to teach them this oral tradition when nobody knows it anymore? Um, so there's a certain amount of, well, let's just, how can we preserve this tradition?
hmm,
That required more explicit notation. Because prior to the chants, which you started also notating fixed pitches, you would have uh, inflection marks above lyrics that weren't telling you specific pitches, but more melodic contour. At least that's what a
yeah,
lot of scholars think. Mhm.
yeah. So the chants are basically the sort of the this is all connecting back to, we it's easy to get sidetracked, but when I was looking at the thing you showed me before this, what, tintinabule,
Uh-huh.
what is, it's a little complicated, the word, I'm sorry. um uh Good, you sent me a couple of other things,
Mhm.
and I'm just curious what exactly the other forms you sent, what the other
So this
sheet.
here is, as I said, this here is an excerpt from Parrot's Berliner Mass. And this is showing an example of that alternating of the tintinnabuli voice around the melody voice. So you can see there in the second bar in your alto, you have a descending G Aeolian scale. And in the soprano, you have a chord tone above the sounding pitch. Then the next note, you have a chord tone below, and then alternating back and forth for the remainder of the word.
Okay.
And if you go to the next page, you see larger texture. And then below, you have just a reduction of that to see what the resulting chordal
Okay. Yeah.
harmony going on. Uh, mhm.
Hmm. It doesn't. You mean when? I mean, but with a choir, it's. I can imagine it sounding nice on the piano because the piano decays. It doesn't quite work, which is why he writes differently for the piano.
Yes.
Um, no,
He
he's
actually,
very. Actually, I would say this sort of is evidence that he's somebody who's fairly adept at understanding the choir. I mean, that's
mhm.
that's quite obvious to you, but for people who aren't experts on Pärt, like myself, um, because there are composers can often get into the issue of writing a bit pianistically because
Mhm.
they know the piano quite well. I was talking before for like an hour ago about Wagner. That's quite clear by Wagner.
Mhm.
In fact, I don't think I'm incorrect in saying that Wagner actually writes harp parts that are impossible to play
Oh, does he use
because
the needs 5 fingers kind of thing?
yeah. He writes chords that just aren't.
Mhm.
So harpists always have to, I guess, change it. I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that's the case.
Yeah, well, part of it.
I'm not a big harp expert yet. I need to
Mhm.
learn a bit more about the harp and how it's played, but that's what
Well,
I've heard.
and I think with Parrot, a lot of this is because a lot of his music results from linear thinking.
Mhm.
So he's thinking first about, let's get a melody voice, which in here it's just for a single voice. We have a scale that's in the alto. We're ascending to uh, a pitch, um, and then in the bass, you just have it harmonizing with the alto, a sixth blow, and then in your soprano and tenors, you just have them alternating chord tones around the melody voices. And so it's very linear thinking. So you don't even really need to sit at the piano to work any of this music out. Um,
Well, no, yeah, first of all, if you did, it doesn't you don't have the same context because you also have to think about each one of these voices has a different color to it. An
True.
alto
Yeah.
sounds different than a soprano voice, than a tenor voice obviously sounds, different than a bass, and then you obviously have the in between like mezzo soprano and baritone and
Mhm.
whatnot, but that's usually not notated. The problem here with the piano is you're not seeing the voices that are switching. You're
Yeah.
just sort of seeing it as and that is another reason why playing it on the piano is actually kind of useless at the moment. Because you don't have the color of each voice
Mhm.
that and the voices that are jumping over the other voices you just won't hear on the piano.
Yeah.
I would play it right now. Um, I think, and then this we have.
So this was a good example of how using different scales and uh, chords can create very unique harmonies. So you can see in the alto and the bass.
Just one. Let me break you up. Could we understand the melody voice more as like the cantus firmus?
Yeah, yeah. Melody's voice is
Except we'd
like the
have
cantus firmus.
yeah, but
Yeah,
we have two here. But they're going
you have
in
two here.
opposite directions to each other. Oh, that's
Mhm.
interesting.
Yeah, so they're
Sort of
they're
mirror
starting
images.
they're
Yeah.
starting on the same pitch, but all then they're mirroring each other. Um, but you can see that, for example, in the alto, you're going to have G naturals, and then in your soprano and tenors, you're going to have G sharp. So you're going to get these very interesting cross relations because of the scale that he's chosen for an M voice and the triad that he's chosen for a T voice.
Okay, so he's got like a polytonal thing going on here, polyharmonic.
Yeah, I mean, polytonal is
Yeah.
uh, a acceptable way to describe it. Because for example, that first sonority is going to come across as E major. Um,
Hmm.
um, but you're not going. But if you're not going to have just E major listening through this.
Obviously, yeah.
Mhm.
Once
And so
again,
this,
though, kind of pointless to play on the piano because it's the cantus firmus
mhm.
situation.
But this is
Um,
another piece that is good to go listen to. This is from his Seven Magnificent Antiphons, um,
okay.
and it's another a cappella choral composition.
Yeah, it's not. This is just so you can see the
The
piano.
resulting
Yeah,
harmonies, yeah.
yeah. The it's just SATB as they call it.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, he writes in the modern way. I often force my students to learn the old clefs for SATB.
Oh, you make them use the soprano clef and the tenor
Yeah,
clef
just
as
no,
well.
I don't make them write that. I just make them practice it because
Yeah.
those actually come into use in other situations where
Hmm.
there is a reason to know the like soprano clef or alto clef. I mean, alto obviously for writing for viola, and
Hmm.
tenor for if you write for cello, or sometimes the bassoon uses the tenor clef too.
Yeah.
It's good to know, but there are other clefs. There's the baritone clef and the mezzo
Hmm.
soprano clef that are important to know. So
Hmm.
I'm just sidetracking him
Yeah.
again, but they're good to know.
Um, you can also see this is something else. The time signatures at the top, because a lot of times the way Parrot will write this stuff is he'll have like one word per bar. Um, you'll see very kind of strange um, meters. And it's because a lot of his music isn't technically metered in the same way. It's more free meter, but these uh, time signatures have been notated this way in order to aid in uh,
Okay,
the performance.
so we have like a 5/2 time or something.
Yeah, I mean it's yeah. So your half note has the pulse. Um,
Right, so 6/2 time and then 3
mhm,
half time. Yeah. Okay. 2/4 time. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Or half,
mhm.
just 4/4 time. Yeah. What are those? What are the six quarter notes? What's
Six
that?
half
What's the
notes.
written? Oh, I just can't see it because it's so
Yeah,
small.
it's very small, but it's a half
Yeah,
note right next to it.
because I was just thinking that doesn't match what's written. All right. So, I think that's the last. Oh
Mhm.
wait, there's more. But wait, there's
And so
more.
I would say this is an example I just wanted to provide just to show the kind of um, complex looking scores that you can still get with this kind of tintinnabuli style. So this is from his Adam's Lament. Um, and I didn't bother annotating any of this simply because it would have gotten far too cluttered far too quickly.
Okay.
Um, but all of this music is um, you and rather than having just a single cantus firmus, you're going to have different cantus firmuses for different instruments and different
Okay.
tintinnabuli voices generating on top of that.
S- All right. So you've got sort of like a textured, s- um, like layer cake kind of.
Well, it's music. It's music that all of a sudden stops looking minimalist. He starts
Yeah.
creating something that looks like, oh, I'm composing in common practice harmony style. This is music that I would expect to see if I was um, picking out a composition for choir and string orchestra. Um, but the way that this is written and generated is different than you would if you're using traditional harmonic practices.
Yeah. But you can tell because the harmonies that result are very atypical.
Mhm,
Now the thing that I just want to draw attention to from my just initial viewing of this is that um, the scoring is actually um, something that's laudable. I think it's clear and concise.
mhm,
I think this is something you always have to keep in mind when you're writing for instruments. People need to know when they come in too. Like
mhm,
that's why you need like other instruments doing the same thing, or other voices doing the same thing, or doing the same rhythm, or coming in at the same point. Um, the nice thing here is we've got exactly those sort of principles laid out. It's quite clear that that Pärt knows that actual musicians need to perform this piece of music.
mhm. Yeah, is it your choirs, functioning all in the same rhythm. You have your
Mhm.
in your first 2 bars, your upper strings are working as a unit, and then in the latter 4 bars, your violins and cellos are functioning on the offbeats, when then your violas and, second violins are, um,
It's also good. It's also
focusing on the
good
pulse.
for the conductor because they can
Mhm,
give everybody their correct. There's enough there to give everybody their cues.
mhm.
So. No, I just it's just something to consider. Um, so you, how did you and why did you get so into Pärt? Because I think a lot of uh, I'm sort of somebody who's just I'm very obsessed with sort of like the composers of the 18th, 19th, and late 17th century.
Hmm.
Um, and up until I'd say Shostakovich, and then it sort of for me kind of like peters out, and my interest is sort of gone by the time. Even though I do like some I do like pieces by Pärt. I probably don't know enough Pärt and John Williams, but I think like the main canon of musics for me sort of peters out my interest around the 70s.
Hmm.
Um, I and I'm completely putting Darmstadt and whatnot somewhere else. I just but because there were still like you know people like Tedesco writing preludes and fugues into the 60s. So
Yeah.
I how does because obviously you're a classically trained musician.
Hmm.
You're gonna you'll probably heard enough Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart. What drew you especially to Pärt, other than him being alive and a contemporary composer?
Well, the thing that first drew me to Parrot was the way that he sets texts. I found I was drawn to the almost objective way of him um, setting religious texts without letting his ego get in the way. Because one of the things he's
Okay.
written about or talked about with his texts is he says the words write my music, um, and
Okay,
that
and
the
how would a composer let their ego get in the way if they're writing? I'm just asking how what would you
so
consider a composer
well
who's letting it?
and so like what I said, he's quoted as saying that the words write my music,
Okay,
or that the music is merely a translation of the words.
okay, so he's like a
Um,
vessel.
yeah, and so that was something that initially drew me to his music. Um, the other thing that I liked about it was that it is tonal.
Yeah.
I'm not very really interested in um, atonality, serialism, but I do like the kind of like very logical, almost geometric thought that comes from that sort of thinking. I just don't like a lot of the music that gets produced with that sort of thinking. Parrot is, I think, stands out with that in that he has these very kind of logical, structured compositions um, that still sound very musical, and so that's, I think, another thing that drew me to it. Um, and then it just continues to be a wealth of very uh, affective music that is enjoyable to listen to um, repeatedly. You don't have to. It's not the kind of thing that I listen to it once and I never need to hear it again.
Right. Yeah, and some pieces you don't want to even have had listened to once.
Yeah.
Um, put it that way. Um, I mean, I'm thinking about a piece I saw once where an accordionist was just, tapping on the keys of the accordion,
Hmm.
like doing this. He did that for like 10 minutes.
Hmm.
And then out of nowhere, he just decided to like a monkey doing cymbals, just do like full stop, whamp, 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 with the most dramatic look on his face. I started laughing in an audience where everybody was sitting very serious, but it's that kind of stuff where I'm like, am I supposed to laugh at this? But I don't want to get into this. This is another topic. I'm just
Yeah.
saying, I think Parrot is a good contrast composer.
Hmm.
And for it he was rewarded.
Certainly.
Um,
Yeah.
I think this is actually what I want to say to the people, a few people watching at the moment, and who will watch later. Um, the composers who are successful are not the people following the sort of Stockhausen, John Cage sort of route anymore. That was a brief moment. To keep doing that now is not just detrimental to your career, it's detrimental to the craft of composing. Because just sort of, I think these composers are focusing on the irreal, stuff that's not relatable to anyone. Like, how weird a sound can I make? And I'll be the first composer to have ever made this weird sound. I honestly think some of them think that, or I'll be the first composer, like I discussed in the last stream with the last thing was, I'll be the first composer to write a piece for car and orchestra.
Hmm.
Um, and Parrot is just, in a lot of ways, is kind of like an old fashioned. There's modernness, there's modernity in it. He's not like, if I listen to Spiegel im Spiegel, I'm not like, oh, this is derivative. This could have been written in 1850. It's not the. It's very modern music, um, but yet it it's it's not at the same time.
Well, I think what he did is he kind of tapped into the sense of eternality of a lot of old sacred music. So, we've talked about Gregorian chant a bit. Um, and, that was a tradition that existed for centuries before it started being notated, and has continued to exist into the present day. Gregorian chant by, sales of classical music albums still remains one of the top selling kind of classical music albums. That's simply just because people like something about it. There's something enduring about it. And I think what Parrott has done with his music is that he's found a way to tap into that enduring quality that is something outside of uh, cultural trends or what's hot at the moment.
Would you say there's like a modal aspect to his music?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 because it isn't tonal in the sense of we're using tonic and dominant harmonies and uh, functional chord progressions. So tonal isn't always the right word to
No, I
use
meant
because
modal. Modal.
no, no, yeah, that's why
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
addressing the fact that we talked about tonality and things like
yeah.
that
Okay,
earlier.
yeah,
Um, and so, just that there's a lot of baggage that can go along with that word tonal that
yeah.
doesn't necessarily apply to pairs. And so modal um, might be a more technically accurate term
Okay,
to describe it.
which is also fitting for somebody who's fairly religious, because our
Religious
accent.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and
Our
engaged with
yeah,
Renaissance music. Yeah.
our. I mean, I'm also somebody who I use modes fairly differently, but I also find I've written pieces that I call modes, but I have my own sort of way of doing things. That's sort of more related to sort of 19th, 18th century theory. But I try
Mhm,
to put in modes into that paradigm. Um, which I know, like composers at the time, Beethoven wrote a piece famously in Lydian, it's a
mhm.
string quartet, um, uh, which I think is probably one of the best string quartet movements he made, and it's fairly obvious to me there's probably some sort of religious connotation to that.
Mhm,
He was probably studying religious works at the time, because he wrote also in his, I think, Missa Solemnis. There's a part in Dorian.
mhm.
Um, well, I think modes are also. I mean, this we all need to find some sort of new way to go as in composition that's not the nonsense stuff. And I think just calling that stuff nonsense is, I have no issue anymore just saying it, because I think the emperor has no clothes at this point. I think
Yeah.
most people with common sense who are not in the dogma just say, Parrot's better. It's just better music. It's better. It obviously, people want to listen to it. He has an audience. He has people who love his music, and he's getting commissions.
Mhm.
Um, uh, the guy, the guy who wrote the piece for, car and orchestra, he hasn't got, I don't know, I haven't heard about him since. So, he maybe got his one big thing there, but you gotta have like things you stick to, your ideals as a composer, I think.
Yeah.
Um, and part of the journey of being a composer is finding influence from other composers. But what is your advice, because you're also a composer now, and
Mhm.
you're young, and you're getting into this realm. What do you think young composers should focus on most of
I
all?
well, one, you have to make sure that whatever you're composing in is style, whatever, is something that you like. You have to personally like it.
Hmm.
You would write in this style without any external factor. Um, and that's simply just so that you have the kind of intrinsic motivation to keep going when you don't have external supportive feedback. Um, and the other thing is that I think it's worthwhile to consider not worrying about whether you're going to be seen as original or not. Because I think by virtue of all of us being individuals separate from one another, even if we compose in the same style, using the same sort of musical tools and techniques, our own personalities are going to come across in that. Um, and that's, I think, self-evident from the vast majority of music history, where you have composers using the same tools to write their music, but their fingerprints still get left on it. Um, and so I think it's worthwhile to explore and basically do style studies, compose in other composers' styles, study their music, master their techniques, um, not for the purpose of imitating, but for the purpose of learning new tool sets in order to build off of. Um, it's almost like you want to learn all of the theory, all of the styles, all of the conventions
It's
in order
almost
to forget it.
impossible, though. Yeah,
Well, you can't learn it all,
yeah.
but you want to strive towards that. Um, and again,
So
not
it's
for
second nature. So it's in
exactly,
the back of
and I like to think all of this stuff as a language.
hmm
Because we've been talking in English right here, and
hmm
I'm not having to do some sort of like complex process of translating my, you know, inner feelings and things like
hmm
that into words that I can then speak. I'm
hmm
just speaking. And I think you should try to master whatever style techniques that you're using in your music to such a degree that you can communicate with that like it's second nature. And I think that's something that is achievable. Um, it might require a certain amount of rejecting uh, modern compositional practice. So one of the things I know a lot of young composers do these days is
I
they're
wouldn't say
always.
it's the practice. I think it's more the dogma that has to be rejected.
I think there's also a certain amount of like physically what you're doing. I think a lot of
Yeah.
composers do. This is what I see with my peers. They're composing into their computer notation software.
hmm
I think it's worthwhile to get used to writing on manuscript paper, um, with perhaps with reference to a piano, but even without it. Um, and the purpose for this is to let the musical ideas come from within you and not be parroted back to you in a kind of garbled, unmusical form by notation software,
Yeah.
or DAWs, for example. Um, and the whole goal there is to find that music that's in you and get it out without it being translated poorly by the tools that we're using to write our music. I think the
Yeah.
best way
I
to do
also
that
think.
is on paper.
Yeah. I also think you have to know who you are, what you
Oh,
stand
certainly.
for.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Parrot being deeply religious in the Soviet Union, he knew who he was
Mhm.
because that. I mean, that was deeply frowned upon. I mean, if you
Yeah.
if you look into the, I think like the history, if I'm not mistaken, things like Santa Claus were banned. I mean,
Well, I was gonna
stupid
say, and
stuff like it's like I mean, it wasn't banned. They turned him into like Mr. Snow or something.
mhm.
I
Yeah.
mean, that's how extreme. And it's like anything that had, and I mean, now people will say like Santa Claus is some sort of like manifestation of consumerism. No, to the communists, not even that
Mhm.
was safe. That was had religious connotation. We had to, Nicholas became Mr. Snow or something. I don't know what they called him, but something
Yeah.
ridiculous like that. Um,
Well, and
but
that idea of getting to know yourself can really only be done by just generally educating yourself better.
yeah.
Um, it's sort of like having hobbies outside of music, perhaps, because we look at lots of composers in history. Bach was another example of someone who was, like a theologian.
Mhm.
You have Eric Satie and, his love of high fashion and culture and all that kind of stuff. Very eccentric kind of thing, but that was just
Yeah.
who he was. Um, I think Sibelius was a big fan of hiking, and
Yeah, it's the same
I
as
know
same with
Mahler
Beethoven.
was as well. Um, Webern too. There's a lot of hikers, a lot of history of hikers and uh, music.
At
And
least
so
the
there's just,
romantic ones.
yeah. Well, Webern wasn't really a romantic, but um,
Well, he did write in the late romantic style briefly. I mean, he didn't write much, but to
yeah.
be honest.
But yeah, it's just a matter of, you educating yourself outside of music. I think is another um,
And
valuable
that's
thing.
why And that's why the few things you taught us today about Parrot, I think, are interesting. Have certainly sparked my interest in little aspects of things I could sort of use if I'm looking for sort of new avenues to use as a composer. I obviously need to listen to a lot more Parrot because I
Well,
haven't.
that's really at least with Parrot, because there is such limited scholarship on it. You know, there's only a handful of books I can recommend to read. Um, some of them are also more on the kind of religious side of it, looking more into like the musicology of it, and so I don't think they're quite as useful to a composer just kind of starting out with it. Um, but the best way
Okay.
is just to go listen to it. Go on. His publisher is a Universal Edition, and so just go on to his publisher's website, find the list of works, and just start listening to them. They also have a lot of perusal scores on their website too, and so it's just like if you like following along with the score while listening, then that's
Mhm.
something that you can do as well. So listening is going to be like the number one thing that's going to help develop your ear and your taste.
Okay. I think, and what would be you said there was a book or there's books that you would recommend that are
Yeah, I was going to say
maybe more useful.
I think the number one book, if you want to learn more about Pärt, is by Paul Hillier. It's called Arvo Pärt. It's from the Oxford Studies of Composers series,
Okay.
and
I
it's a
I,
fairly
I cannot, yeah. I can
it's a
recommend those Oxford books about music. They
yeah.
have a very good musicology department. They produce a lot of good
Yeah,
stuff.
and Paul Hillier's book was the first book really looking at Parrot's music and his life. Um, it basically everything that's come after it is citing this book. Um,
Okay.
and
And when
so
was the
it's
book? When did the book come out?
in the '90s, I believe. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
so
So
you'll be able to find it in libraries, and you can probably purchase it online too. And you know,
Amazon, yeah.
yeah,
All right. I think that just about does it for the chat today. Um, Thanks. I'm actually very interested now to look into more because I used to just think like, oh, he's just like another minimalist. That's how I sort of categorized him.
and he's not. There's a very limited part of his output that you can call minimalist.
Hmm.
It stops being minimalist very quickly. Um, and that's why I think he's just so significant is because he can't really be fit into any specific camp. He's kind of found a way to transcend just about any label that you can put on him. And I think that's something that all of us as composers should be aspiring to, is to not be under one umbrella, but um, beyond any specific label.
Well, thank you, Robert Roast. I think that was a good
Of course. Yeah.
conclusion, and um, thank you for joining us. And hopefully, we can maybe do a chat about. Um, you recommended that we maybe do another stream in a few months from now where we talk about how composition is from the in academia. This is sort of similar discussion as I had last month, but from the position of a student as
Mhm.
opposed to from a professor. So I'd be fairly interested in doing that. So
Of course. Yeah.
if you'd be interested, we could do that. Otherwise, I'd like to bid everyone Farewell, and I'll see you next month. Bye.